An orphan student was working as a waitress at a millionaire's anniversary party, and when the birthday celebrant noticed her, he was left speechless. Lola, who had recently turned 19, was a first-year student at the Faculty of Philology. The girl didn't remember her parents and spent her entire childhood in an orphanage. She dreamed of having a family, but luck wasn't on her side. No one ever adopted her. Lola adored books and spent all her free time reading. As a result, it wasn't too difficult for her to get into university. This was a turning point in Lola's life. Now she no longer had to follow the strict schedule set by the orphanage, and she had a chance to discover the world from a completely different perspective and find her place in it. Moving into the student dormitory, Lola found herself among other students with various life experiences. It took her some time to adapt, as initially, she felt as if she had come from a different world. Lola was placed in a room with 3 other girls who had come from different cities. The orphan quickly became friends with them, as they were cheerful and full of life. Lola enjoyed her new student life. In the mornings and afternoons, she attended lectures where esteemed professors discussed famous literary works and analyzed them. Each lecture was a revelation for Lola, and she couldn't wait for the next day to go back to her studies. "I chose the best faculty in the world. Here, you don't have to do anything but read a lot, and that's my most favorite thing in the world," she thought excitedly. In the evenings, Lola and her new friends spent time together. She especially grew close to Pilar, who was the most outgoing and vibrant of them all. They walked around the city and talked about everything under the sun. With each passing day, city life captivated Lola more and more. Together with her friends, she visited cafes, attended club parties, theaters, and cinemas. Soon, the girls realized that if they wanted to attend interesting events, look good, and be able to spend time in cafes every day, they needed to find a part-time job. So, they started looking for one. However, it wasn't easy. Many jobs required a full day, but the girls had to attend lectures during the day. One day, Pilar came home with her eyes sparkling. The other roommates were not in the room at the time. Lola was lying on her bed, reading a historical novel. Seeing her friend, she smiled and put the book aside. "Lola, we've hit the jackpot," exclaimed Pilar. "My aunt found me a part-time job. She said I could bring one of my friends along. You're the first one I saw after talking to her, so I decided to invite you." Lola was thrilled to hear the news. "But what kind of job is it?" she asked. "We'll be working as waitresses at banquets in my aunt's restaurant. She has a really nice place in the city center, and she doesn't need full-time waitstaff. But when someone wants to celebrate a birthday or wedding, she needs extra hands. So, she's looking for 2 pretty girls who can help." Lola smiled. "That's a great opportunity. I'm in. The first banquet is this Friday. My aunt will be expecting us at 5 o'clock. Lola couldn't believe her luck. Now that she had a job, she might be able to fulfill her dream. In secret, Lola dreamed of traveling to a small town in the north of the country, known for its cozy bookstores and literary museums. Pilar's aunt's restaurant attracted everyone who wanted to escape the city bustle. A small, neat building with tall windows overlooking a busy pedestrian street drew attention with its aesthetic appearance. The interior was stylish yet warm and homey. The walls were decorated with images of village houses and blooming gardens. The air was filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and spicy scents from the chef's signature dishes. The restaurant was always crowded, especially during lunch and dinner hours. Pilar's aunt had earned the love of customers of all ages and professions: businessmen, artists, writers, young mothers with babies, lovers, and elderly couples, all found something special here. Both locals and tourists flocked to taste traditional Latin American dishes prepared with love and skill. Here, one could try tender braised beef tongue served with mashed potatoes and spicy salsa, cheese and chili potato dishes, marinated pieces of fresh fish with citrus and spices, and more. When Lola entered the restaurant, she was charmed by its unique atmosphere. "Yes, I want to work here," was her first thought. Pilar's aunt greeted the girls warmly and led them to the staff room, where she gave them uniforms and aprons. After Lola and Pilar changed, her aunt began to instruct them. Today is a very important banquet. A well-known businessman and millionaire will be celebrating his birthday here. There will be about 50 guests. You need to be at your best. Hearing this, Lola felt a knot form in her stomach. She was scared she wouldn't manage. But, looking at Pilar, she felt calmer. Her friend appeared calm and confident. I won't be lost with her, Lola decided and smiled. Pilar's aunt showed the girls where the dishes, napkins, towels, and cutlery were and explained how to serve the meals properly. Everything sounded quite simple, and after the briefing, Lola felt much more confident. Today, we'll see a real millionaire, Pilar announced excitedly once her aunt had left. Lola picked up one of the glasses they needed to clean and smiled at her friend. Maybe he'll fall in love with one of us and marry us. What do you think? Pilar asked thoughtfully. Lola shrugged. I don't know, she replied. Do you even know how old he is? Pilar took a towel and started helping Lola with the glasses. You're right. What if he's 80? She giggled. Lola couldn't help but laugh, too. Time flew by in Pilar's company. The girls set up long tables, decorated them with fresh flowers, and prepared the hall for the guests. Then, they went to the staff room to rest. Pilar's aunt took care of them by leaving fresh fruit and drinks on the table. Seeing the snacks, Pilar and Lola practically pounced on the food. They hadn't realized how hungry they were. They laughed and joked until Pilar's aunt popped in to let them know that the first guests had started arriving. Lola and Pilar quickly got ready and went out to welcome the elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen. The birthday boy himself hadn't arrived yet, but a huge multi-tiered cake had been brought in, adorned with the numbers 45 made out of marzipan. So that's how old this millionaire is, Lola whispered to Pilar. I think he's a bit too old for you. Pilar stifled a giggle in response. You're right, Lola, she replied. What a pity. At that moment, the doors opened, and a tall man in a light suit and a pale lemon shirt with a white bow tie entered the room to the applause of the guests. He had dark curly hair with a touch of gray at the temples. Lola and Pilar realized that this must be the millionaire himself. The man hadn't even reached the table when he was surrounded by friends, who showered him with bouquets, gifts, and loud congratulations on his birthday. Lola noticed that the gentleman looked a bit shy, which surprised her. She didn't think millionaires could be bashful. Finally, the man took his seat at the head of the long table, and the other guests sat down as well. Suddenly, the sounds of a violin and saxophone filled the room, catching Lola off guard. She glanced in that direction and saw two elegantly dressed musicians, both around her age. What handsome guys! Pilar nudged Lola, having also noticed the musicians. I wish we could get to know them. Lola rolled her eyes. All you ever think about is boys, Pilar, she said reproachfully. We're here to work, remember? Pilar adjusted her apron. You're right, friend. Time to serve the appetizers and drinks. The two girls hurried to the kitchen, picked up their trays, and began serving the guests. The guests joked, laughed, and paid no attention to them. When Lola approached the birthday boy, he glanced at her quickly and was about to look away when something made him stop. He stared at her intently for a few moments, then his expression changed as if he suddenly felt unwell. What's wrong, Mr. Perez? Someone asked, but he didn't answer. Lola looked at the millionaire and accidentally met his gaze. Something about the way he was looking at her made her feel uneasy. Why is he staring at me like that? She wondered. Maybe my makeup smudged or something's wrong with my uniform. With these thoughts, she quickly emptied her tray and hurried to the storeroom, where there was a large mirror. Mr. Perez watched her with a lingering gaze. After checking herself thoroughly, Lola found no flaws. Everything was as it should be. She shrugged and headed back to the kitchen to fetch the remaining appetizers. As soon as she re-entered the hall, she caught Mr. Perez's gaze again. What's going on? She thought anxiously. Does he like me? But he's so much older. Lola continued to serve the guests, pretending not to notice Mr. Perez's inquisitive look. When she went back to the kitchen, Pilar approached her. Did you notice that our millionaire can't take his eyes off you? She asked with a teasing tone. Lola nodded. Yes, and it's very strange, she admitted, feeling uneasy. Pilar picked up a pack of napkins. So what? Maybe he wants to get to know you, she asked innocently. What do you mean? Why? Lola didn't understand. I'm just a waitress. And I'm only 19. Pilar simply shrugged. Well, who knows what his preferences are, she said philosophically. Lola stared at her friend in horror. You think so? What should I do? Pilar neatly folded a napkin before looking at her. What can you do? Just keep working. You're safe in your aunt's restaurant. Lola nodded and took Pilar's advice. She continued serving the guests, acting as if she didn't notice anything. However, she constantly felt Mr. Perez's gaze on her, and her heart thumped with anxiety and worry. When the guests finished dining, the host appeared in the hall and began inviting Mr. Perez's friends to step forward one by one and make a speech. Lola, Pilar, and the other waitresses cleared the dirty dishes from the table and quietly left for the kitchen. About half an hour later, the restaurant's owner informed them that the guests wanted to try the festive cake. The girls quickly brought clean plates and cutlery into the hall. Once again, Lola noticed that Mr. Perez was still watching her. Unable to hide her nervousness, she took a clumsy step and twisted her ankle. The heel of one of her shoes cracked, and Lola realized it was broken. Trying not to attract attention, she hurried to the staff room, afraid that Pilar's aunt would be angry with her for this mishap. Hiding in the small storage room, Lola sat on a low wooden bench and tried to catch her breath. The heel was indeed broken. What am I going to do? She thought in despair. She had no other shoes with her. At that moment, someone knocked on the door, making Lola jump. Come in, she exclaimed, bracing herself for the encounter she wasn't looking forward to. Her intuition didn't fail her. Mr. Perez entered the tiny room. Lola pressed her hands to her chest and stared at him. Forgive me, he said softly. I seem to have frightened you. Lola nodded in response. His gentle tone eased her nerves a little. Why were you looking at me all evening? She dared to ask. I'm sorry once more, Mr. Perez repeated. It seems I made you nervous. Yes, Lola whispered, then added quietly, I just don't understand. Mr. Perez nodded toward the empty space next to her. May I sit down? He asked. Of course, Lola replied, moving over to make room for him. The millionaire sat down on the bench and looked into her eyes. What's your name? He asked. Lola quietly said her name. Lola, Mr. Perez repeated, and after a moment of silence, he continued, You see, Lola, when I first looked at you, you reminded me of a friend of mine. A very good friend. Lola perked up. Really? She asked, hardly believing her ears. Yes, the millionaire nodded, his eyes clouding over as if he was lost in distant memories. His name was Xavier, and we studied in the same faculty at university. That was more than 20 years ago. That long ago? Lola exclaimed in surprise. The millionaire closed his eyes. Yes, it was a long time ago. How quickly time flies, he said. Lola watched him intently, waiting for him to continue. Xavier and I lived in the same room in a student dormitory. That's why we became friends. I was fortunate to have him as a roommate. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have noticed him. You see, I was the son of a wealthy man, while he came from a very poor family. Senor Perez sighed and continued. Looking at you, I remembered all his features once more, the dimpled chin, the thoughtful brown eyes that always seemed to gaze straight into your soul. You really do resemble him. I thought perhaps you were related. Lola shook her head sadly. I'm an orphan, I have neither a father nor a mother, and I don't know if I have any other relatives. I grew up in an orphanage. As far back as I can remember, I lived there. Senor Perez looked at the girl with a sympathetic gaze. And where is he, your friend? Lola asked. Did you lose touch with him? The millionaire just shook his head. Unfortunately, he passed away, he said quietly. I learned about it from the newspapers. By then, he was already quite a well-known figure. The details of the last years of his life were told to me by my cousin, who was friends with my friend's wife. I'm so sorry, Lola whispered. For some reason, Senor Perez's words touched her deeply. The hope of finding a relative, which had been born when she heard she resembled the man's friend, instantly faded, and Lola felt the familiar sadness of loneliness that had followed her since childhood. Tell me about him, Lola asked. The man nodded. We met when I entered the Faculty of Management, and Xavier joined the Faculty of Philology. Hearing this, Lola flinched. I study there too, she said. What an amazing coincidence, the man responded and, after a brief pause, continued his story. Xavier was a poet. He wrote poems from a very young age. According to him, they came to him almost fully formed. He rarely engaged in editing or rewriting his lyrical works. I believe Xavier was a true genius. But others didn't even notice him. He appeared ordinary and even mediocre. Yet behind his mundane exterior lay an enormous, unexplored world. Lola exhaled upon hearing these words and gripped the edge of the bench. Something in Senor Perez's words made her heart beat faster. At first, I didn't really want to communicate with my strange, reserved neighbor. I was one of the most popular guys at the university and had plenty of friends. Girls would follow me everywhere, and I spent my free time attending student parties and concerts. I was heavily involved in sports and was rarely home. But one evening, everything changed. I was deeply in love with a girl and wanted to be with her. However, to my astonishment, she rejected me and began dating my friend. When I found out, it hurt me deeply, and I came home early, not wanting to see anyone. Xavier was there. He was sitting on his bed, surrounded by sheets of white paper, quickly jotting down lines of poetry that came to him spontaneously. What are you always writing? I asked irritably. At that moment, I was angry at the whole world, and my neighbor seemed like an easy target to vent my resentment and anger. Poems, he replied seriously. Do you want me to read them? I was about to make a snide remark, but to my surprise, I nodded instead. And then Xavier began to read his poetry to me. From the very first lines, I fell in love with his words and the voice with which he read them. I listened to Xavier, forgetting about everything else, not even noticing the hot tears streaming down my cheeks. My new friend read his poems to me until late at night, healing my pain. When he grew tired, we turned off the lights, but I couldn't sleep for a long time. I felt immense gratitude that Xavier had poured a healing balm on my wounded heart. That's how we became friends. We started going everywhere together. I dragged Xavier to parties, we watched movies at the cinema, and dined at cafes. My former friends were very surprised to see me in Xavier's company, but I didn't care. It was then that I understood the true value of friendship and that you should never judge people by their clothes or social status. Such true words, Lola whispered and fell silent again. She was eager to hear more of Senor Perez's story. And then Xavier fell in love, the millionaire said. And I was partly to blame for it. But how? Lola asked in surprise. One day, I invited Xavier to my cousin's birthday party. She was studying biology. Her best friend, Camila, was there too. Like all of us, she came from a very wealthy family. At the party, Xavier couldn't take his eyes off Camila, and when we returned home, he immediately started scribbling down new lines of poetry that had been swirling in his head all evening. I jokingly asked if he had fallen in love with Camila. I noticed you didn't take your eyes off her, I said with a smile, to which Xavier very seriously replied that from now on, his heart would be filled with a love that would never fade until the day he died. Unfortunately or fortunately, he was right. Having said this, the millionaire sighed sorrowfully. Lola saw how much he missed his best friend. "And what happened next?" she asked cautiously. "Xavier asked me to find out Camila's phone number, so I asked my cousin. Xavier sent a message to the girl he liked, but she didn't reply. My best friend was heartbroken, and poems flowed from him like a river. The next day, he went to the library, typed out his ready-made lines on a computer in the computer science class, printed numerous copies, and hung them all over the university. He wanted Camila to know the tender feelings he had for her. That evening, my cousin called and said her friend was touched by the poems Xavier had dedicated to her. Knowing how delighted Xavier would be, I suggested to my cousin that we all go to the cinema together. She promised to call Camila and tell her about my proposal. I hung up and waited for the girl's decision. My cousin didn't call back for a long time, and I lost hope. Poor Xavier. It seems his heart will be broken, just like mine, I thought. At that moment, the phone rang, and my cousin said Camila agreed to go to the movies with the four of us. Overjoyed, I told her we'd pick them up in a taxi on Friday evening and rushed to share the news with Xavier. He couldn't believe his ears and was ecstatic. The next day, he came home with a big bag. "What's in there?" I asked in surprise. "A new suit," Xavier replied seriously. "Are you really going to the cinema in a suit?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Of course," Xavier nodded. "I want to make an impression on Camila. I want her to understand that my intentions are the most serious." I didn't argue with him. I put on my usual jeans and a t-shirt, while Xavier dressed in a suit with a bow tie and bought a huge bouquet of white roses. It seemed he had spent his entire scholarship on it. I felt sorry for him, but I didn't try to dissuade him. As I had already realized, Xavier had his own way of seeing things and was quite stubborn. We took a taxi and went to my cousin's house. The girls were already waiting for us outside. They looked more than charming. I noticed how Xavier breathed out in awe when he saw Camila in a beautiful white dress with small flowers. "These roses can't compare to your beauty," he said, handing her the bouquet. She smiled shyly and took it. "They're beautiful," Camila said. Afterwards, we watched a comedy film at the cinema, and everyone really enjoyed it. Once it ended, we decided to take a walk through the streets. The air was filled with the pleasant sense of blooming flowers, and thousands of stars sparkled in the clear sky. The night was beautiful. I walked beside my cousin, sighing as I recalled my own love. Xavier and Camila strolled a bit behind us, and I could hear him reciting his poems to her. How romantic, I thought. My cousin was sure that Camila's heart would soon melt. Xavier was courting her so beautifully. I thought so too. And we were right. "How wonderful," Lola breathed. "I always knew that true love conquers all obstacles." Senor Perez cast a quick glance at her and continued. Yes, Camila fell in love with Xavier as well. They began dating, the two of them always walking around hand in hand. Xavier surrounded Camila with care and love. He fulfilled her every wish, somehow finding the money for movies and cafes. As it turned out, he was writing poems on commission. With each passing day, Xavier and Camila fell more deeply in love. Finally, the time came for her to introduce him to her family. Xavier was very nervous as he prepared for the dinner with Camila's parents. He carefully ironed his suit and new shirt, polished his shoes until they shone, and even went to the barber for a haircut. When Xavier left the dormitory, he was as pale as a sheet. I wished him luck in my mind. I remember that day I stayed home to watch a football match. I spent the entire evening in front of the TV and didn't hear Xavier come back. When I woke up, I saw him lying on his bed in his suit and shoes. "Hey, Xavier, what's wrong with you?" I shook his shoulder. "Leave me alone," my friend answered. I realized something unexpected had happened and decided to wait until morning to talk to him about it. When I woke up, he was still lying in bed, his face turned toward the wall. I approached him again. "Are you finally going to tell me what happened?" I asked. At first, Xavier remained silent for a long time, and I thought he had decided to ignore me. Her father is against our relationship, my friend finally said. He says I'm not worthy of his daughter. I patted him sympathetically on the shoulder. Of course, Xavier continued bitterly, I'm just a penniless nobody, not a brilliant descendant of royalty. You're a brilliant poet, remember that. I retorted. Xavier turned sharply and looked me in the eyes. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. Yeah, a brilliant poet without a cent to his name, he replied quietly. I was surprised at how deeply he took it to heart, but then I remembered that Xavier had always been very sensitive. To Camila, that doesn't matter at all, I said. Xavier nodded. But her father is right. I can't provide for our family. I need to think about how to earn a stable and decent income, Xavier murmured thoughtfully, wiping his face with his sleeve. That's a good thought, I said. From that moment on, Xavier never left his laptop. He was at it when I woke up and still browsing web pages when I fell asleep. Xavier neglected his lectures and barely ate. I didn't know how to help him. Whenever I asked, my friend would just ask to be left alone. At that moment, Aunt Pilar peeked into the little room where Lola and the millionaire were sitting. When she saw the man, she was both surprised and pleased. Senor Perez, here you are. Everyone's looking for you. The guests are worried about where you've disappeared to. Oh, I'm sorry, the man exclaimed. Please don't misunderstand. I was just telling Lola about the old times. Aunt Pilar nodded understandingly. Yes, on such a day, it's hard not to recall the past, she agreed. Tell the guests I'll be there in a couple of minutes, please, Senor Perez said. When the woman left, he sighed, still lost in his memories, and addressed Lola. I want to see you again and tell this story to the end. And I want to hear it, Lola replied. Her eyes were shining. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow, the millionaire asked hopefully. I'm completely free after my university lectures, Lola responded. Then I'll pick you up at your building, and we'll sit at a nearby cafe, the man decided. Lola nodded, and Senor Perez stood up. Now, please excuse me, I must return to the guests, he said. As Lola and Pilar walked back to the dormitory, the girl was silent almost the entire way. What's wrong, Lola? Her friend asked, surprised. You're so quiet. It's the story Senor Perez told me, Lola said thoughtfully. What? Pilar exclaimed. You talked? Yes, Lola nodded. He told me about a friend I resemble very much. This story made my heart beat faster. Are you sure he's not deceiving you? Pilar suspected something was amiss. Lola just shook her head. No, I hear sincerity and sadness in his voice. The next day, Lola eagerly waited for her lectures to end. After class, with a pounding heart, she stepped out of the university building and immediately noticed the familiar figure of the millionaire. He was waiting for her on a bench. Hello, Lola, Senor Perez greeted her as she approached. Hello, she replied. I'm glad to see you. I noticed a cozy coffee shop across the street, the man said. Shall we go there? Okay, Lola agreed, and they headed toward the bright sign with a steaming cup of coffee. Entering, the girl was surprised to find that the barista seemed familiar, though she couldn't remember where she had seen him before. The millionaire seated her at a table and went to place the order himself. 2 cappuccinos, please, he said, and the barista nodded in response. When the coffee was ready, Senor Perez continued the story he had begun the day before. A few weeks passed after that ill-fated dinner at Camila's. Xavier still didn't go anywhere. But one evening, I didn't find him at home. I laid out my textbooks and began preparing for an upcoming exam. Suddenly, the door to our room opened, and my friend stood on the threshold. Glancing at him, I was amazed at the change. Xavier was glowing with joy. In his hands, he held a paper bag, from which a bottle of champagne peeked out. Are we celebrating something? I asked. Yes, Xavier nodded. I won a poetry competition." Hearing this, I was overjoyed for my friend. "Congratulations. You absolutely deserve this victory," I said. Xavier entered the room and began taking out the treats from the bag. There were shrimp, mussels, and various kinds of cheese. "Where did you get the money to buy all this?" I asked in surprise. Xavier looked at me and smiled broadly. "I told you, I won. I received a large cash prize," he confessed, adding enthusiastically, "but that's not all. A well-known publishing house signed a contract with me. They want to publish all my poems." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. "That's amazing," I exclaimed happily. "You can say that again," Xavier replied joyfully. Since then, everything had gone incredibly well for my friend. That year, 5 or 6 collections of his poetry were published. Xavier became quite a famous author, and he was invited to various performances and poetry evenings. My friend started receiving large fees, and money was no longer an issue for him. However, several months passed before Xavier mustered up the courage to visit Camila and speak with her father. Before the meeting, he was very nervous again. Yet, this time, I was almost certain that luck would be on my friend's side. And so it happened. Camila's father welcomed the young genius with open arms. He said that he had read all his books and would now gladly accept him into the family. Xavier and Camila were very happy. They spent every day together again, always holding hands. Their time apart had intensified their feelings, making them even stronger. Xavier bought an engagement ring and proposed to Camila under the most romantic circumstances. He invited her to dinner on a rooftop, where they were served by a waiter in a tuxedo, and a violinist played live music. At the mention of the word violinist, Lola suddenly stirred. She remembered where she had seen the young barista. He was the one playing the violin at the millionaire's birthday party. Lola quickly glanced at the young man. He was looking out the window. She recalled Pilar's words about wanting to introduce her to young men and blushed for some reason. She realized that she really liked the young barista. At that very moment, the young man looked at Lola and gave her a friendly smile. The girl blushed and quickly turned away. She focused again on Senor Perez's story. A couple of months later, Xavier and Camila got married. Everything was more than perfect. My friend rented a beautiful apartment in the city center, where the newlyweds settled. Xavier and Camila's feelings seemed to grow stronger every day, and they were very happy. My friend's career was also on the rise. He published new books and was invited to perform at concerts. After some time, his books began to be translated into foreign languages, and Xavier was invited to poetry evenings abroad. My friend and his young wife started traveling around the world. It was a wonderful time. And then Camila became pregnant and could no longer accompany her husband on his trips. Saying this, Senor Perez sighed sadly. Sensing the sadness in his voice, Lola became worried. "What happened next?" she asked. Xavier and Camila started to grow more distant from each other. He was constantly away from home. Of course, he brought his wife many gifts and sent her flowers, but it wasn't enough. Camila needed Xavier, not all these soulless things. Her cousin, who remained her best friend, told me that Camila started crying often and felt very lonely. Xavier, on the other hand, was becoming an increasingly successful poet. He participated in literary festivals, gave interviews to magazines and newspapers, and made new acquaintances. He was inspired by beautiful places, and his world expanded. Meanwhile, Camila stayed at home, preparing for the arrival of their child. She lacked attention, and with each passing day, she felt more abandoned. One day, returning from another trip, Xavier noticed that Camila was acting cold and distant with him. "What's wrong, my dear?" he asked, worried. Camila began to cry. She complained that he had completely forgotten about her and their child, that there was no room for them in his life. "You live only in your creative world. Why don't you just marry your poems?" Camila accused Xavier. My friend tried to calm her down but failed. The next day, she left for her parents' house. Xavier tried to bring her back, but Camila didn't want to see him. A month later, she gave birth to their child. Xavier came to her house with flowers, and Camila's mother finally let him see his wife and daughter. Senor Perez's words made Lola startle. So Xavier had a daughter, she thought. The millionaire took a sip from his paper cup and continued. When Xavier saw his wife and baby, he cried with happiness. The young couple reconciled, and my friend took his wife home. It seemed their life had brightened again. Now they had a daughter who made them happy and loving parents. Xavier canceled all his trips and performances for a while. Now he spent all his days with his family. So, everything ended well for them? Lola asked, but stopped short, remembering that Senor Perez had said his friend was no longer alive. Yes, but... The millionaire's eyes filled with tears. Everything would have been fine if not for that accident. Accident? Lola gasped. Senor Perez took a shaky breath. About a year after their daughter was born, Xavier was invited to a poetry evening in a neighboring city. At first, he didn't want to go, remembering that it was more important to be with his family. But when Camila heard about it, she suggested they go together. "We can leave our daughter with my mom," she said. Xavier smiled and kissed his wife. "Thank you, my dear," was all he said. On Friday morning, they took their daughter to Camila's parents and drove to the neighboring city by car. The evening was magical. The young couple immersed themselves in the enchanting world of poetry and relaxed. They planned to stay overnight at a hotel and return home the next day, but late in the evening, Camila's mother called and said their daughter had fallen ill. Xavier and his young wife became very worried and decided to leave immediately. While they were halfway home, on a dangerous stretch of road with a serpentine, it began to rain heavily, and hail started to fall. The rising wind shook the car from side to side. An exhausted Xavier lost control, and the car was thrown into a ditch. It flipped over several times and fell off a cliff into a ravine. Xavier and Camila died. Saying this, the millionaire couldn't hold back his tears. Lola felt her eyelashes tremble. "That's so sad," she whispered. They remained silent for a while, trying to cope with the emotions that had overwhelmed them. Lola herself didn't know why this story had touched her so deeply. Finally, she dared to ask, "And their daughter? What happened to Xavier and Camila's child?" Senor Perez shuddered. Lola noticed that he didn't want to talk about it. "Another tragedy occurred," he replied quietly. "What kind?" Lola whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Nervously, she picked up her paper cup but didn't touch her coffee. Xavier and Camila's daughter went missing. When she was 2 years old, she went for a walk with her grandmother in the park and was playing in a sandbox. The elderly woman received a phone call and got distracted for just a moment, but when she turned back to her granddaughter, she was gone. Frantic with fear, the woman ran around the park and the surrounding area, shouting the girl's name, but it was all in vain. The little girl had vanished. They say she was kidnapped. The police never managed to find her. "How strange," Lola murmured. The millionaire cast a probing look at the girl. "That's why, when I saw you, I couldn't take my eyes off you. You look so much like Xavier. How old are you?" 19, Lola answered anxiously. Xavier and Camila's daughter would have been the same age, the millionaire exclaimed. Lola shivered. "You think?" she began. "Yes," Senor Perez interrupted her. "I think you are Xavier's missing daughter." For a moment, Lola stared at the man in silence, trying to digest what she had just heard. "But how can this be confirmed? I don't remember anything about my parents. My early childhood is shrouded in fog." The man ran a hand through his hair. "There are many ways to discover the truth about your origins nowadays. There are special tests you can take at any medical center." Lola's eyes widened. "But all of this is very expensive," she mumbled. "Don't worry about the money," the millionaire interrupted. I'll cover everything. Lola nodded. She felt as if she was standing on the brink of a mystery that was about to be revealed to her. As she left the coffee shop, Lola didn't even notice that the young barista was watching her with a long gaze. The next day, the girl and the millionaire went to a medical center so that Lola could take the test. When the procedure was over, she was informed that the results would be ready in a few days. Lola nodded and waited eagerly for the answer. She was desperate to find out if Xavier and Camila were truly her parents. The day after her university classes, Lola and her friend Pilar decided to grab a coffee and chat. When they entered the familiar coffee shop, they were greeted by the same barista. "Nice to see you again," he smiled and winked good-naturedly at Lola. Pilar looked at her friend in surprise. "That's the same violinist from the restaurant," she whispered as they settled at a table by the window. "Yes," Lola nodded, feeling a bit embarrassed. "And I like him." Pilar sneaked a glance at the young man, who was reading a book at that moment. "And it seems he likes you too," she said with a giggle. Lola rolled her eyes. She knew Pilar saw love everywhere. However, this time, her friend was right. As the girls were about to leave the coffee shop, the young barista approached Lola and asked for her phone number. Feeling a sense of inner joy, she wrote it down on a piece of paper and handed it to him. The next day, the young violinist invited Lola to a classical music concert, and she gladly agreed. They had a wonderful evening, and afterward, he walked her back to her dormitory. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and the sweet scent of flowers filled the air. "Thank you for a lovely evening," he said, kissing Lola on the cheek. She blushed and nodded in response. The following day, he asked her out for coffee, and they spent another evening together, chatting about various topics. Once again, the young violinist walked her home, and this time, he kissed her on the lips. Their kiss seemed to last forever, and Lola's head spun. She realized she was falling in love. The next day, Senor Perez called. "Lola, the test results have arrived. I'd like to meet with you in person to discuss them." The girl agreed excitedly. The millionaire came to the university once more, and they decided to take a walk in a small park nearby. Lola's heart pounded as she thought about finally discovering the truth about her past. "Lola," the millionaire began when they sat on a wide bench near the fountain. "The test showed that you are the daughter of Xavier and Camila." Lola gasped, and tears streamed down her face. "So, they were my parents. How sad that they're no longer here." The man gently took Lola's hand. "Yes, but we will always remember them," he said. Lola nodded. "But who could have kidnapped me from the park? And why? How did I end up in the orphanage?" The millionaire only shrugged. "We may never find the answers to those questions," he replied. They continued to stroll through the park for a while, each lost in their thoughts. Before they parted, the millionaire looked at Lola and said, "Your grandparents are still alive. I can take you to them this weekend. They live in the suburbs. I would be very grateful." Lola answered, tears in her eyes. "You've done so much for me." Senor Perez bowed his head in silence. "It's nothing. Xavier was my best friend, and I will never leave his daughter in need." With these words, he took Lola by the arm and led her out of the park. Soon, the girl met her grandparents, who welcomed her with tears in their eyes. For the first time in her life, Lola felt surrounded by people who truly loved and cared for her. Lola and the young violinist started dating and fell in love with each other. They carried their love through all their years as students and got married after graduating from university. They spent their honeymoon in the book town, which Lola had dreamed of for so long.